The major role of Central Zoo Authority is to facilitate zoos in development, during their construction, and animal exchanges. We provide technical assistance. We do provide funding assistance also to the zoos. And in India, the zoos are not only for raising awareness, but they are also very important for species conservation. We have 152 recognized zoos in the country. That includes several rescue centers as well. Next, please. So as I said, that for us, zoos are not only the place of visitation by the people, but they are also important for species conservation. In our country, total approximately about 70 million people, they visit our zoos per year. And zoos are, as you know, a very important place for gaining the knowledge on wildlife conservation, especially for the kids and especially for the aged people. We have prioritized, depending upon the threatened level, endangered level of the species, we have prioritized 27 species, and we are working on ex situ conservation through our participating 36 zoos in the country. And there have been little, or rather not that satisfactory progress on ex situ to in situ relationship, like the Oneplan Approach, which the IUCN and the global community has been propagating. But we have been successful in breeding white-rumped Indian slender-billed vultures. We have 100 plus population. Indian chevrolet 122 plus, and greater one-horned rhinoceros, approximately 20 individuals we have. And we have several success stories in situ and ex situ linkages, like red panda, Indian chevrolet, cheer pheasant, western tragopan, ghadial, snow leopard. We have mouse deer, and all this. But still, I feel that a lot of things can be done. As you are aware, we have been very good track record. We have very good track record of in situ conservation of wildlife. We are the largest tiger range country in the world. More than 70% wild tiger population is in India. We are the largest Asiatic elephant. We have the largest Asiatic elephant population in the world. We have largest single horn rhinoceros population in the world. And we are the home. India is the home for only home for Asiatic lions, that they are in the Gir forest. So we have very good track record in situ conservation of the wildlife in our country, because the wildlife is deeply imbibed in our social and cultural ethos. But there is a lot of things to be done as far as ex situ and in situ connection of wildlife is concerned. We need integrated species recovery plan for threatened native species, restore and secure self-sustaining wild population. As I said, wild population, we are very good track. We have more than 700 national parks and sanctuaries, network of all these things. So we are doing good at that. For we need capacity building, national and international cooperation for species conservation, especially in captivity, that is zoos. We also need our zoos also need the funding support and facilitation. And I think there is a lot to be learned from the international community. I've seen that in international zoos like San Diego and all, they have specialized in conservation breeding of many species, including single-horned rhinoceros and all. And I think we need to pool up. We need to bring the best practices of ex situ conservation in India by interacting or by kind of entering into MOU with the best zoos in the world, so that we can also have a good breeding in our in captivity in our zoos, and so that we can progress towards one plan approach and bring them to the wild habitats. With these words, I'm really waiting. I'm excited to hear Rupali as well as Dr. Oni Meyer, and I'm looking forward for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your opening remarks. Now we will come to the keynote of the day. So I'll request Dr. Oni Byers. Oni Byers, you can set up your presentation. Meanwhile, I would like to speak about you and inform the viewers that Dr. Oni Byers has a PhD in reproductive physiology, and she's done a postdoctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian National Zoo and has been the chair of CPSC since 2011. She leads CPSG small staff, but for large global network of planning experts and partners, and is responsible for strategic direction and partnerships to the CPSG program. Madam, you would like to tell us more about the One Plan approach, so over to you. We can't hear you. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Can you see me? I'm a little bit old, so I'm just learning this technology here. But I wanted to thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you today. And those opening remarks were absolutely perfect in terms of setting up what I'd like to share with you. Before I get started, I just wanted to recognize the challenges that we're all under due to this unprecedented pandemic. And I'm so sorry about the stress that that's put on everyone and on zoos in particular that have really been suffering. And I wish you all and your colleagues and your families good health. I wanted to start today by telling you a brief good news story. I think we can all use a little of that. And this amazing creature that you're looking at here is the Kihansi spray toad. And these animals are unique among amphibians because of their fabulous bright yellow color. They're 2 centimeter size. They're about the size of your thumbnail. And instead of laying eggs, like most amphibians, the females give birth to babies that are smaller than a grain of rice. And Kihansi spray toads live in only one place on the planet, and that is at the base of the Kihansi Gorge. In Tanzania, these toads receive a constant misting from the falls. So this creates this perfect, cool, moist climate that they require. But in 1996, the population, which was estimated to be about 50,000 individuals, came under threat because a hydroelectric dam was going to be constructed near the gorge to provide much needed electricity to the surrounding areas. As a result, of course, the spray zone dried out and the toad population plummeted. The species was close to extinction. But before it disappeared completely, the government invited herpetologists from 2 zoos in the United States to collect toads in order to guard against extinction. They brought these toads into captivity and bred them as a source for reintroduction in the future when conditions might be right. And fortunately, that time came in about August, I think. It was about August 2010, after construction of the world's largest gravity-fed artificial mist nest. mist system. So this had never happened before. They made an artificial mist system to return that perfect climate. And the first 100 toads were returned from the Bronx and Toledo zoos to Tanzania. They flew first class, and the president met the motorcade and led them back to the gorge. There are now over 4,000 that have been reintroduced, and the wild population is thriving. This is a really remarkable reversal for a species that had at one time disappeared, almost disappeared, not just from this spot, but from the planet. And I feel that we don't very often hear good news stories in conservation. We talk an awful lot about the doom and gloom, but there really are good news stories. There are success stories like the Chianti spray toad, like some of those that we heard about in the opening presentation. And I'm extremely proud of the role that my organization, the Conservation Planning Specialist Group, and our partners play in enabling these successes. For example, in the case of the Chianti spray toad, the government invited CPSC to bring together all the stakeholders, the community representatives, industry, scientists, so that we could help them form a strategy for how many, when, and under what conditions the Chianti spray toad could be returned to their home in Tanzania. And this is the kind of work CPSG has been doing for exactly 40 years. This is our anniversary year. And CPSG, as some of you may know, is part of the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. IUCN is the oldest and largest global conservation organization. And it's based in Switzerland and made up of 6 commissions. And one of those commissions is the Species Survival Commission. And the SSC is in turn made up of over 100 specialist groups. Most of those are taxon-based specialist groups. So there's a cat specialist group, crocodile specialist group, but there are several that are cross-cutting, and one of those is the Conservation Planning Specialist Group. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the US, but we have regional resource centers all over the world, including one in South Asia. CPSG South Asia was in fact our first regional resource center, started by the late and great Sally Walker as CPSG India, and it then evolved with her leadership into CPSG South Asia. CPSG has been developing cutting-edge conservation planning tools for all these 40 years. We design and facilitate science-based participatory processes to minimize risk of extinction. What we do is bring the right people and the right science together. And most importantly, we establish the right atmosphere, one of trust and collaboration. And we use quantitative risk assessment tools. This is an unusual aspect of our work, but we usually a tool called Vortex we use to evaluate a variety of possible management scenarios to assist in conservation decision making. In just this past year, 2019, CPSG and all of our regional resource centers conducted conservation processes on behalf of 371 species in 86 activities in 28 countries. And even though we're a small office of only 11 around in Minneapolis and around the world, we do have a volunteer network of 304 members that make this work possible. And everything we do is underpinned by a philosophy that we call the Oneplan Approach. It's essential to everything we do, and it's something that we're really eager to convey to all of you today. And the Oneplan Approach is a system of integrated conservation. It's for all species, whether they reside inside or outside of their natural range, and under all conditions of management across the spectrum from wild to captive. And we believe strongly in engaging all responsible parties so that we can bring all resources to the table. And this needs to begin at the very start of any planning process. It's very common for plans to be produced and then try to get buy-in for them from the people who are responsible either for implementing them or who are impacted by those plans. And we believe strongly that those people need to be brought together from the very beginning of a planning process so that it's owned by everybody. It seems obvious, doesn't it, that that's how you should do planning? I think it does, but the fact is that it isn't the way planning is generally done for conservation. We have people who focus on the wild populations, and those people come together and they develop plans for those wild populations with the goal in mind of having a long-term viable population in the wild. At the same time, and in many cases for the same species, we have people who are experts in those species in captivity. And those zoo and aquarium community experts come together and they develop plans, and they do it with a viable ex situ population in mind. All of these people are experts, and they're all doing the very best work that they can do with the end point of species conservation in mind, but they're doing it separately, and only occasionally is there cross communication so that that ex situ population can do its very best to enhance the long-term survival of the population of that species in the wild. What the Oneplan Approach calls for is bringing all of these people together on a level playing field at the beginning of a planning process, have them together identify a common goal related to the long-term survival of the species in the wild, and then look at how they and their expertise and the resources they can bring can be used in unison, in harmony, towards that shared common goal. This is what we call the Oneplan Approach. And we've been absolutely amazed by the enthusiasm by which this approach has been embraced by the international zoo community. And it's been used, of course, to develop plans for populations of species all over the world, hundreds of species, from tiny goblin ferns in the forest floor in northern Minnesota to gorillas of Uganda and Humboldt penguins and Hungarian meadow vipers and many more. And a few years ago, we put some of these stories together in a book that you can find on the CPSG website called Second Nature. And to be completely frank, we produced this book to brag about CPSG, to talk about the great work that CPSG and our partners have done. But what we actually created was a book about the conservation work of the international zoo community, because every single one of these stories illustrates the extremely valuable contribution, the role that zoos played in the survival of all of these species. And of course, there are many more out there that didn't make it into this book. But sadly, in spite of all of these wonderful and important individual conservation successes, the fact is that by all indications, we're not succeeding, not yet anyway, and certainly not at a scale necessary to avert the crisis. You're all aware, as well as I am, of the threats that this planet is facing, from deforestation and land conversion, pollution problems, and global warming, of course, poaching and the illegal trade in wild animals and animal parts, disease, and the overwhelming threat of global human population growth and all the things that come with that. We're also suffering, of course, from a lack of political will in general, and now the unprecedented impact of the COVID pandemic on species, on government priorities, on funding. It's all pressing down, and what it means is that there's an increasing number of species threatened with extinction. I'm sure you're all well aware of the IUCN Red List, the most respected global authority on species status. This slide's a little bit out of date. There's been an update to the Red List since the slide was prepared, but at the time of the over 85,000 species that had been assessed by the Red List, almost a third were classified as either vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, or extinct in the wild, meaning that they're threatened to increasing degrees with extinction. And it's not just these numbers at a particular moment in time that are important, but it's the trends. And these trends are alarming. The Red List Index, shown on this slide, measures trends in extinction risks over time. As you can see, all taxonomic groups that have been measured so far are declining. Corals are declining most rapidly, and the amphibians are the most threatened taxonomic group overall. But there is good news. There really is. And the good news is that conservation planning helps conservation action be successful and reverse these trends that we're seeing. Conservation works when it's effectively planned for. And a very recent study that's just now being submitted for publication by Caroline Lees in Auckland, New Zealand, has shown that this Red List trajectory that I showed on the previous slide, that's consistently declining, can be slowed and in fact reversed with effective species conservation planning. On this slide, you see this little flag. That's when the planning workshop took place. And immediately you see a slowing in the decline in species status. And by 10 years, you begin to see a reversal and an increase in status of those species. That's the really exciting point. And that's why we all need to come together, all of the stakeholders and all of the experts in the zoo community and the wild conservation community. Because what we know is that conservation planning works to reverse the decline in threatened species. But right now, the work of CPSG, as valuable as it is not making a dent around the world in the crisis that we're facing. And we have a vision of every species that needs a plan being covered by an effective implemented plan. In order to do that, we absolutely must answer the question, how do we scale up planning to catalyze more effective conservation action? So we recognize that there are successes, and we recognize that conservation action can be effective if it's planned for. So how do we do this at a scale that will change what's going on this planet? And CPSG is working on this on a number of different angles. We're developing multi-species planning tools. We're trying to build capacity around the world in species planning. We're developing partnerships that allow us to amplify the work. And through those partnerships, we're assisting governments in making progress towards their commitment to national and global biodiversity targets. So I just want to quickly share with you a couple of the new tools that we've been developing for rather than looking at a single species at a time, looking at multiple species and getting a handle on their planning needs. The first is called the Integrated Collection, Assessment and Planning Workshop. And that is an ex-situ conservation assessment for a group of species that's done based on the application of the IUCN ex-situ conservation guidelines. I hope that you're familiar with those. And if you're not, you can find them on the CPSG website or on the IUCN website. But those will step you through a process for looking at all the species that are in captivity or might be usefully in captivity for the purposes of conservation, and helps you to decide if they're needed and what kind of a process, what kind of a program would be best to make the very best contribution to conservation. In those workshops, the in situ and ex situ experts are, of course, as I said, together at a level playing field from the beginning of the process. We're very thrilled with the work that the zoo community has been doing in applying the ICAP process. And the very first one was conducted in Omaha for canids and hyenas. And I'm really pleased to say that the Central Zoo Authority participated actively in that process. A more recent tool that we've developed is called Assessing to Plan, or A2P, because the conservation cycle begins with assessing, bringing together all the information, then doing effective planning in order to have implementation and conservation action on the ground. So one of the things CPSG wants to do is move more quickly and move more species more quickly from the assessing phase to the planning phase. So we do this through a 5-step process that we call Assessing to Plan, or A2P. We first do that data collection, look at all of the data from the IUCN Red List. Using that, we take the group of species and sort them into planning, what we call buckets, planning buckets, and then develop projects for each of the groups of species in those buckets. Then we identify stakeholders to take each project forward and assign a group of species with the responsibility for delivering, a group of people for to take responsibility for delivering on that project. So again, you get all of these different kinds of information, all this data from the IUCN Red List. We bring that together and the IUCN Red List category of threat. And using that, we take the group of species we're looking at, and that information helps inform our putting those species in bundles dependent on the kind of planning most needed for those species. For each of those buckets, then, these project bundles are created. And this slide shows you those project bundles for South Asian reptiles for an A2P workshop that was conducted last year. Each of these bundles has a person or a group of people attached to it to ensure that it's implemented. So stage 4 is the identification of those key stakeholders responsible for each project. And then there's a group of people assigned for project delivery across the whole body of projects. That's really been effective for us so far, and there's a great deal of interest from zoos, governments, NGOs in that assessing to plan process. So we're able to move more species more quickly, but we still need more people to be doing this work around the world. So we've developed an initiative for capacity building that includes online courses, many of which are free. We have face-to-face training courses in facilitation and planning and species risk assessment. We have a series of webinars, and we have 2 very intensive programs that are called development path programs. One is for planners, for learning to design and to facilitate workshops for individual species or groups of species. And the other is a technical development path where people are taught how to do quantitative risk assessment and disease risk assessment. Both of these development path programs are very intensive. They're 18 months long with training, mentoring, and coaching throughout that time period. So together, this multi-species planning and the capacity development is really increasing the planning capacity around the world. But if we're really going to ensure that all species that need a plan are covered by an effective plan, we need to amplify this work within various regions of the world by partnering with zoos or zoo associations, with NGOs in those regions, and then together with the partners, engaging with governments so that we can help those governments achieve national and global biodiversity targets. And we're doing this through our regional resource centers, including the CPSC South Asia. We have goals for the next 4 years that include kind of transforming regional resource centers into mini headquarters so that they act just as the global headquarters do, but for the regions. We want to see a minimum of 1 paid CPSG representative in each regional resource center. Right now, most of those people are volunteers. And it's amazing what we've been able to do over the years with volunteers. But we've come to realize we have to have a paid representative dedicated to CPSG work in each of the regions so that they can actively coordinate teams to get this work underway. Each of those representatives, those paid representatives, would automatically be given a position on our development path, and all the members of the team would be trained in IUCN red listing, assessing to plan, planning, design, and facilitation, quantitative risk assessment, and the use of vortex and disease risk and other critical tools to do conservation planning effectively in the region. And they would, of course, get consistent expert support from the global CPSG community. So this is what we'd really like to see, what we actually think must happen for CPSG South Asia and all the other regional resource centers if we really are going to attack this problem and see within the next decade a real change in that trajectory of species species status around the world. And I'm so thrilled that Rupali is here to talk to you about Wildlife Reserve Singapore and CPSG Southeast Asia, because they are a model of exactly what we're talking about here. So thanks so much for your attention, for your interest in CPSG and species conservation planning, and I hope you'll reach out if you have any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronnie Byers. I fantastically enjoyed your talk, especially the bit on the Kinhasi spray toad, which flew first class. So that's exciting news. And also your entire overview of the plan. So we look forward to working more with you, especially the Indian zoos. And yes, and thank you so much. And we did have CPSG South Asia Representative Dr. Sanjay Molu to also talk and speak in this webinar, but unfortunately he had issues with the corona in the family and he could not join us. But however, we got the second best, and which is in a way nearest to us, which is Ms. Rupali Raghavan, who is the coordinator for the CPSG in the Southeast Asia region. Rupali, you've been kind enough to join at the last moment, so thank you so much. And a bit about you. You've been a wildlife biologist by training with a master's degree from the Wildlife Institute of India. And you've been with the Wildlife Reserve Singapore since 2013. And currently you hold the position of Assistant Director, Conservation and Research. So over to you, Rupali.
Thank you very much, Sonali. I'd like to thank Dr. Ani Byers for a wonderful presentation on CPSG. So my role on talking about CPSG Southeast Asia, a regional resource center, is entirely covered by what she has shared. So I shall share a perspective from what a zoo could possibly do with CPSG, and how zoo in conservation as a zoo association in Singapore, we have used CPSG for our conservation work. For those of you who are aware, Wildlife Reserve Singapore is a group of zoos that we have in Singapore. We have 4 parks at the moment: the Jurong Bird Park, Singapore Zoo, Night Safari, and River Safari. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of our introductory slides because I was given a heads up that we should also have time to take in some questions. So we'll go through the introduction slightly quickly. Wildlife Reserve Singapore is a member of the Southeast Asian Zoo Association and also members of the IAZA and Australasian Zoo Associations, in addition to being an IUCN member as well as a member of the World Association of Zoos and Aquaria, just like CZA is. Our mission that we have set for ourselves is all visitors that come into our parks actually have a meaningful and memorable experience and leave by getting empowered to want to conserve biodiversity, hopefully in wherever we go back to. So we are focusing on protecting biodiversity in Singapore as well as the Southeast Asia region. Our business model recognizes that we will only be able to do good work, do any conservation work, if we as a company does well as well. So we rely entirely on our ticket sales and the revenue that is generated from retail stores in our parks or the food and beverage sales in our parks that actually goes into the conservation support that we have shared within the region as well. So this is a valid business model that is helping us do the good work that we are doing. We've set ourselves, of course, the WASA has guidelines on animal welfare standards as well as conservation guidelines, and those are documents that we do use in our practice. And we recognize that any good zoo or any zoo that is existing today has to ensure the best quality of life for animals that are under our care, and has to ensure that visitors that enter or visit the park leave with increase in knowledge, increase in awareness, and also a kind of motivation to contribute to conservation. In addition to that, good zoos also work towards ex situ conservation and research, and that is evident from all the work that you all are doing as well. And we've also taken the step towards tying in the work we do with in situ support. So this support is largely financial support that we share with regional conservation partners. WRS is currently supporting over 40 projects across Southeast Asia, and these partners are ranging from lone conservation biologists to national NGOs and also big international NGOs that are working on species and landscape conservation in the region. Of course, we hope to aspire to get to the stage where we as an organization will be leading field conservation management and species conservation projects ourselves. We, at the moment, do not have full-time staff who are leading in situ conservation work in the field, and we aspire to get there and in the near future. The IUCN approach to species conservation, which is the Assess Plan Act that Oni also spoke about, is what we are using as our strategy for conservation as well. We are working to set up a Southeast Asia hub for red listing, where we are building capacity in-house as well as working very closely with the red listing of species in the Southeast Asia region. We're hosting numerous red listing workshops in our parks and bringing all the experts together to ensure that the assessment is done in for the species in the region, leading to the planning through the CPSC Southeast Asia Regional Resource Center that we are convening through Wildlife Reserve Singapore. And last but not least, the implementation of the work that needs to be done on ground through the action with all the conservation work that we support. As mentioned before, Southeast Asia and Singapore is where we are focusing our conservation work. I shall deep dive into my first example. There are two examples that I thought I would share today on how we have used the CPSG to facilitate us and the conservation work that we are hoping to get done both in Singapore and Southeast Asia. The first example is a 3 centimeter small crab that is found only in Singapore, endemic to Singapore, known as the Dhihara Singaporeans. It was discovered in 1986 by Professor Peter Ng from the National University of Singapore. And being as tiny as it is not necessarily charismatic, is not seen by many people. It's found only in 5 sites in hill streams in Singapore. Many unknowns about the species, and we had actually, through the Wildlife Reserve Singapore Conservation Fund, supported a researcher to do in situ work to understand more about this species, and discovered that there were fewer than 100 mature individuals that remain in the wild in Singapore, and also the type locality where the species was described from had lost the population over there. So we got together with all the people who are involved in conservation, typically the academia, university, the government agency, the National Parks Board, and us had gotten together to decide that action needs to be taken for the species. But looking at the CPSG approach to ensuring that all relevant stakeholders are involved, this 3-day workshop actually became much bigger. It actually had participants from the Ministry of Defense, which happened to have owned the land that part of the stream that the crab habitat belongs to, the National Environmental Agency that is responsible for vector control and mosquito populations control, that the fumigation work that they do actually leads to possibly impacting the crab and its habitat. The Public Utilities Board that actually manages the stormwater drains, etc. There is potential for their work also having some impact on crab habitat, as well as any land use change that is governed by the land authorities over here are needed to be active participants having their opinion shared in how the actions, future actions for protecting the crab is heard, and come to agreement with everyone, all stakeholders, to come develop a future plan for the species, ensuring that it is successful and surviving in the wild long term. So the 3 conservation actions that derived from this workshop, one of course was trying to get to know more about the species, simply because we did not have enough knowledge. And the Oneplan approach also led to people believing that yes, there are very few in the wild, there are numerous areas, current habitats that are under tremendous threat, hence the need for an ex-situ population and conservation breeding for release is essential at this stage for the species. And of course, awareness raising amongst all stakeholders on why species conservation is essential. So we set up a facility in WRS in 2015. And of course, we couldn't trial with Dhihara Singaporeans to start off with. So we started with a lesser threatened species, the Paracelsus maculata, and worked on basic husbandry requirements for the species and monitoring the growth of the crabs and their survival. Shifted to the Dhihara Singaporeans after a year plus, when we figured out that the water quality is suitable for that as well. And what I'd like to highlight over here, and something that I'm sure all of you working on ex-situ plans also are aware, was that if there were so many unknowns about the species, if we actually sequentially tried in a single facility to trial the various parameters of what are the habitat requirements, what are the nutrient requirements, what are the various daylight, various sensory requirements for the species, it would have taken us at least 10 to 20 years to figure out what is the reproductive needs for this elusive species. So we were open, and it's the collaboration between the university, the National Parks Board, and WRS as a working group to set up as many facilities as possible to try the trials has actually led to females successfully brooding hatchlings. And we've managed to release some of these back into the wild in 2019. So CPSG played a very important role in ensuring that the Dhihara Singaporeans, it's still work in progress, but at least we have a plan, and we are reviewing the plan periodically. Moving on to the next example that I had was pangolins. So WRS has been active in the Sunda pangolin conservation, and we started off without much knowledge about pangolins. In 1999, when we received a large confiscation of pangolins, the animals, of course, were compromised severely because they were confiscated from illegal wildlife trade and eventually did not survive, but that identified a lot of gaps in knowledge that we built upon consistently over the last 2 decades and ensured that we are at least able to take care of a species that is native to pangolins as well as the rest of Southeast Asia. Pangolins, of course, are not only found in Singapore. The Sunda pangolin has a wide geographic range. So when we were talking about conservation planning for the species, we realized that the threats are extremely different when you're talking about them in the population in Singapore and comparing them to the region. The region, of course, is the biggest threat is illegal wildlife trade and poaching, and the need for conservation in that area was identified in the conservation planning workshop that we did in 2018 as working on demand reduction, increased enforcement effort, as well as ensuring that live confiscations are released successfully. And when you look at it from a Singapore point of view, the National Action Plan actually identified that trafficking was not the biggest threat, but traffic was. Pangolins, while they were moving between habitats, were crossing roads, and injuries and road kills were the main reason that pangolins in Singapore were threatened, which required ensuring a lot of interagency collaboration to mitigate the change in land use, or if effectively to make sure that there are wildlife-friendly efforts taken when there is land use change that's happening. Again, work in progress. Another thing I'd like to highlight that this workshop throughout was the conservation biologists themselves that attended this workshop were uncertain on whether there was any ex situ role that the Sunda
new strategic plan that will be coming out next year, WASA's conservation strategy, and of course, all CPSG philosophy is this integration, as I said, of all the stakeholders from the beginning of the planning process. What we're seeing is the development of a global species action plan at the IUCN level that WASA and many zoos around the world have signed on to, as have many NGOs as well. And that's going to do exactly what you've asked about, this integration across all of these global biodiversity conventions and individual zoo association strategies. We're looking to bring all of those things together in one species-focused action plan. And we would really love to see the Central Zoo Authority engaged in that work.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that is useful. So if I may ask then Dr. S.P. Yadav, sir, like taking on the cue from Dr. Ronnie Byers, that how do we, there is intensive conservation breeding management of species in India for sure. For example, if we take the case of the Great Indian Bustard, or for that matter, our reptilian species and others. So is there any role for international cooperation in India's conservation breeding programs, and how do we further strengthen this, especially in the South Asia context?
Okay, the species conservation is an integral part of our national zoo policy and a very, very important aspect of wildlife management in the country. We are trying to focus on prioritized species. In fact, the CZA has moved a proposal with the Government of India for enhancing, for getting this funding support to focus species conservation breeding in the zoos. I think like cheetah, we lost in 1947 from our country. So there are many species which are lost, and it's very difficult to get them into the wild. Unless this one plan approach is adopted, and unless we do captive breeding and then release into the wild, this captive breeding should be supportive to the wildlife conservation in situ. So that's very, very important aspect. And as I said, it is important part of our national zoo policy as well. We need to learn a lot. We, in fact, as I said in my opening remarks, we need to bring in all best practices of species conservation across the world in our country. Now, the knowledge is power. We must get the best available knowledge, where many zoos, they have specialized in successful in situ breeding, like we have seen the pangolin works in Singapore, similarly rhinoceros in San Diego, and there are many species which people are working. They have developed the methodology, they have developed the guidelines, they have developed they have worked on nutrition aspects and all such things. I think there is very good opportunity when all these zoos and captive breeding facilities, they come together, share their information, and serve to the cause of wildlife conservation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I will take one question for Rupali. Rupali, that was very informative. And if you may please also from your India experience answer this, because we are largely looking at an Indian audience today. Do you think that the CPSG's, that entire planning and participatory approach for endangered species in the Indian subcontinent has kind of diminished, or in a manner we have slowed down in the last few years? And how do you think we can strengthen that, especially South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the nearby regions?
Well, Oni touched upon this briefly when she was talking about the regional resource centers. I am not in a position to comment on whether there has been any reduction in the work, CPSG work in South Asia. I'm sorry, I don't have information on that to comment on it, but the challenge of regional resource centers is largely because they have volunteers. It depends entirely on availability of external funding for supporting species conservation. And I'm not sure whether that could potentially be a barrier. Another possible hindrance could be ensuring that all stakeholders do come together. It is a process that doesn't happen overnight. It requires ensuring that trust is built within various communities that sometimes have conflicting and very strong conflicting points of view. So ensuring that trust is built and getting people to notice CPSG or build the profile of CPSG as a neutral facilitator and get people to be comfortable to come for those workshops is also essential. So I feel if we work actively towards that, both of those approaches, it will be very helpful for all regional resource centers.
Thank you so much, Rupali. I'm afraid we don't really have time for any further questions, but thanks once again to all our expert speakers, our listeners, to make it a wonderful evening today with all of us, and my team at Caesar Day and the team Mysuru for all the background support. We will be in touch, and rest assured we'll continue this collaboration with all of you at CPSG. So good night and thank you so much.
Thank you.